Welcome to the Market Mentors podcast, Nick.
Hey, how's it going, Matt?
Absolutely. All good here. Thank you. All good. So before we get stuck into this one, I'd love to know a little bit more about you and your background and what you're currently up to right now.
Sure, definitely. So, I've been in B2B marketing now for the better part of a decade. And of 7 of that, I've been at various stages of B2B SaaS companies, from very, very early sort of seed stage startup with Defense Storm, less than 20 employees. Does anyone want to buy this? All the way through to, more established startups like Global App Testing. And then most recently at V, where we're resuscitating a brand that, has had some interesting connotations over the last few years. So it's kind of like executing a startup in a company that has a 9-year-old history, which is really interesting. We explain it as kind of like switching cars as you're driving down the motorway at 75 miles an hour. You don't often get the opportunity to start at a company where you already have 1,000 customers. And so then what do you do with that? Like, how do you then become a startup again?
It's like a restart. It's like a restart.
It is. Yeah, it is. It's exactly like a restart, actually. And that's, there's baggage, of course. There's always going to be some baggage. And so I think from that perspective, it's been really exciting.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool because you've got some stuff to go at, haven't you? Rather than it just being a totally blank sheet of paper, which, has its benefits too, I guess. But at least you've got some stuff to play with. You've got some data. You've seen what's happening. They've got some customers and, you've got some things to actually do from that. So it sounds pretty exciting. So we're obviously here to talk a little bit about sort of playbooks and sort of developing your own playbook. But initially then, why do you think marketers are obsessed with playbooks?
I love this because I think marketers are obsessed with podcasts with playbooks, because there's an innate desire to have a roadmap put out in front of you with easy, repeatable steps that you can just sort of step in, execute, and complete. There's something comforting about that, right? It's a warm blanket over you, and you're like, right, I know what to do. I can come in, I can execute, I can do exactly what I've done previously. And as someone who's had, 3 SaaS, roles in the last 7 years at different B2B companies, each time, I've been hired on the strength of what I've done the last time. And if your interview process is any good, you're doing something similar. But you can't just go in and do that same thing, even though it would feel really comfortable to do that. You know what to do. And unless you're really just moving from industry, from one company to another in the same industry, you're going to be very, very upset if you just sort of execute the same old playbooks that you've been executing, because, at the same time, the business around you is different, and the world in the industry that you're in is likely different as well.
Yeah, well, I like the idea of a playbook. I'm quite sort of process driven as a person. So the thought of actually, being able to take a playbook and work through it from sort of A to Z, interests me certainly. But I get what you're saying. What do you think some of the problems are with following a playbook necessarily is then?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I'm not against playbooks. I actually really enjoy and really suggest that you do create playbooks wherever you're at. And I think that having a playbook for demand generation and marketing overall is a really, really smart idea. And because it allows you, like you said, to have a complete sort of process from A to Z. And I think the problem with using existing playbooks is that you are essentially trying to replicate what someone else has done, even if it's you trying to replicate something else you've done sort of in the past. It's sort of like when you watch, remakes or reboots of your favorite TV show, and they've brought all the old cast together. It's a hot thing right now, and it feels close, but it's just not the same. The characters are now 30 years older or 40 years older or whatever. They're doing similar things, but it just doesn't feel quite the same. It doesn't have the same impact, doesn't capture the same zeitgeist, if you will. Yeah. And the problem with that is you stick to it. You're going to generally stick to that, and you might get okay-ish results, and you might be lulled into a sense of like, oh, well, that's actually doing okay. that's not bad. Let's renew this reboot for another season, even though it's actually not that great and it doesn't capture the same intensity. And I think there's a real problem with this, not just following your own playbook, but I think there's a real problem with sort of these playbooks from other companies that are, other people will come out and say, oh, this is the playbook I use to grow from 1 million ARR to 150 million ARR. So you get really excited because you're at 3 million ARR and you don't really know what to do, and you're struggling to get to that next milestone. And so you pick up someone else's 150 million ARR and you think, oh, this is great, this is fantastic. I'm gonna whack this in, and this will solve all of the problems. And parts of it might work for you, and you might be feeling like, actually, yeah, okay, this is okay, this is all right. But in the case that unless you've got an identical product, an identical audience, and an identical sort of time, it's going to be very, very difficult to have that work for you. I know plenty of companies who during the pandemic, said, oh, the switch to webinars was fantastic for us. It was absolutely incredible. And everybody just loved it. And it was just smack on. But, not everybody had that same experience, but everyone was trying to sort of implement a webinar playbook and a webinar program. So depending on sort of your audience and depending on who you were targeting, webinars might have been a complete catastrophe for you. And in that situation, you can invest a lot of time and effort for not much reward, even though that same playbook, got someone to 50 million ARR, for instance.
Yeah, and I think time is the crucial bit that you were certainly sort of resonated with me, because if you're thinking about tactics like SEO as an example, trying to compete on keywords that a business was creating content for 5 years ago is next to impossible these days. And you think about if you type in anything related to marketing, a brand audit, whatever it might be, who's going to be appearing at the top. It's going to be the usual suspects of HubSpot and businesses like that. So I think the time element is a critical one as well. So let's create a scenario then. We've just joined a new business as a marketer, and we're going to create our own playbook. From a metrics point of view, what do we need to know first and why?
Oh, this is a great question. I think the first thing, I think the first thing you need to know is what do you want to know, and what's important to that business in the stage of that business. So if you've joined a new business and the business really is new and doesn't have very many customers at all, you're not going to have much data to pull from. It's going to be very difficult for you to sort of take a very data-driven perspective at this. And even when I joined V, the assumption was that there's quite a bit of data to pull from. Well, actually, no, there wasn't sort of a lot of data to pull from, which is sort of bizarre in that respect. It just sort of seemed like, oh yeah, that data wasn't necessarily being captured from an acquisition perspective. On the product side, it was fantastic, of course, but the actual marketing side of things, there was no funnel metrics or math to go off of. That posed a bit of a problem because you need to understand initially what your acquisition costs are. Like, what's it costing you to get a customer currently, right? Is that effective? Is it working for the business? What are the conversion rates within the funnel? Like, where are deals coming in? Where are they getting stuck? And where are all those hanging out? And I like to think of things as like, the Christmas tree. Do you have a Christmas tree funnel, which, you've got lots of deals fat at the bottom and you've got nothing up at the top. And people in the business might tell you, oh, the thing we need to focus on is improving the conversion at the bottom of the funnel. Well, if you've got a really big Christmas tree type funnel, and you can imagine that the top of the funnel, it's very pointed and there's not very much in there. If you make, and you've only got 10 deals and you make a 10% improvement, you're not going to be, getting very far ultimately in your acquisition. And what you want to do is then be looking at those kinds of things and saying, actually, as much as I'd love to improve the bottom of the funnel, if we just got a bunch more in at the top, if we focus more on the awareness of the company, we're going to end up with a lot more deals just by virtue of the effort. And especially if you're the first marketer in the business, let's say, you've got to really choose what you focus on, and you can't be pulled into too many scenarios all at once. I think once you've established those kinds of things, the lifetime values of your customer, the time to value, what do customers enjoy about your product, and where do they find that things are really working for them, that's when you can start to develop the playbook. That's when you can start to figure out, okay, this is how we're going to start experimenting and figuring out what should go into the playbook.
Because you're thinking of like you said, a funnel then, basically. So you can almost just map out some broad metrics to say, okay, well, if we're putting this amount in the top, we're going to get this amount at the back. And we know roughly how much that's costing us at the moment. And we know roughly how long, a client is, or the lifetime value of a client. Therefore, we're going to get payback at this date. So you can almost like a bit like a mathematician, I guess, then start to just sort of play around with that model in your head, or even on a piece of paper or wherever it might be.
Yeah, I definitely do it. I do it on Google Sheets or Excel or whatever, and I'm transparent about it and put it out there immediately. So everyone to see, like, this is the mathematics of where everything's at currently. And, it might, everyone might have some preconceived notions about things and about how improving, the bottom of the funnel is where we need to be because we need to get more deals across the line. But actually, even if we improved that by 50%, which is a huge increase, we're adding one more customer. 2 more customers maybe, when actually we want to increase the top of funnel by 50% so that we can add a lot more at the bottom.
Makes sense. What about messaging then, or repeatedly getting prospects interested in what you have to say? Why is that important? And is that kind of like a feeling then that you're getting in that, I guess, that sort of pipeline velocity, sort of people sort of moving through that funnel fairly quickly, or is it something that you can measure?
There's a little bit of measurement, and then there's a little bit of thin slicing. I'm a huge fan of Malcolm Gladwell's I'm a huge fan of Malcolm Gladwell and his notion of thin slicing, which is when you've got enough information to make a decision that actually more information isn't going to improve or worsen that decision making. And so you can absolutely get data to test some of this stuff. And I highly recommend implementing things like Google Optimize, right away to start running tests on your messaging on all your pages, or as many pages as you can, just to see that is there a difference? Are things changing when you make changes? How do customers react to a wholly different set of messages? Once you do that, you can then start getting some data. Now, as most SaaS early stage or even mid stage startups aren't going to have massive amounts of traffic whereby you're getting statistically significant results here, but you can get a general feeling, like after a couple of weeks, okay, this is generally generally a better messaging to go with, and then make that the new message. Make that the new message, and then move on, and then test it again, and then make that the new message, and test it, and test it, and test it. Keep on refining it, but then using your gut to make that decision, and then sort of flow that out to the rest of the business. I'm a fan of having the SDR team or your outbound team or your development team as part of marketing as well, because they have access then to the newest messaging as fast as possible, and you can roll those learnings out across your demand generation function very quickly, and that allows you to then get that velocity you were mentioning, and that's where maybe some of the performance can be measured, especially if you do it in a cohort analysis kind of way. You can say, right, in October we used this kind of messaging. Okay, well, how did that affect our funnel? And then in November we used this type of messaging. Well, that was worse for the funnel. Let's go back to October's and see, can we improve that?
Yeah, and the SDR team can do that from a qualitative perspective as well, I guess. They can be testing the message. Is it landing? Are there any reservations? What are customers saying? Are there any questions? And that sort of gives you a bit of an understanding of how it's been received by prospects as well.
Yeah, they're your front line.
Yeah.
They're having more conversations with prospects than you could ever possibly hope to have. And so getting regular feedback from them about what they're hearing and what people are saying back to them in response to the messaging that you have out there is sort of your gold gold nuggets that you can pull from.
So we've sort of built the sort of funnel from a metrics point of view. We've talked about the kind of messaging and working on that messaging. Once those two bits are done, then how do you sort of decide what sort of channels to use? I mean, there are so many channels out there these days.
It's 100% where your target customer, your ideal prospect, lives and breathes. And it's only that place. It's only that place as often as possible. In the same way that I'm a big advocate of experimenting and testing various messaging, the same thing goes for quick iterative tests in those specific channels. There's a when I was at Global Testing, there was a one of the targets is very technical folks, and they don't necessarily enjoy being outbound messaged on LinkedIn or outbound messaged really at all. So you've then got to find, where do those people live? Even if you know from a previous business, you can create leads via LinkedIn, that target audience just isn't living there. They just don't live and breathe that. They live Stack Overflow or, Hacker News or, somewhere else like that. So it's that playbook thing where if you're just applying the playbook you've used before, you can probably get some leads from that, but it's not going to generate the massive sort of groundswell that you're looking for. So, but all that has to be taken into context of, can you afford to advertise in that channel? If you can, then you've got to try to drum up guerrilla tactics to sort of be involved and be able to talk to them, not surreptitiously, but actually be a member of that community and engage and be there to help and support.
Yeah. And if you're working as a sort of smaller team, then, I mean, would you suggest sort of picking a smaller number of channels and giving it more attention then, or would you sort of think about going broader to start off with?
Run your tests, run some tests in a couple of sprints, have, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2-week sprints, testing lots of different messaging and lots of different, channels. Figure out where you're getting the earliest traction possible, and then double down in that channel as much as possible. Have 3 or 4 maximum areas that you're paying attention to, including, broadly SEO, if you're doing that, paid, and then really just sort of double down into those areas and make sure that that's where you live and breathe, as much as possible, and that you're feeding that back out. And I think that's where you're going to find the best results. I mean, that's how I decide what channels to use. And until we've sort of tapped that well completely dry, then that's when you move on to another channel. Everything has its ceiling.
Yeah. And what about sort of SEO then? Because that's more of a longer play, isn't it? It's just a bit harder to perhaps experiment that you can do with, say, paid ads, for instance. How do you sort of think about that?
Yeah, I think of SEO as a very long-term gain. Some of the results that I was getting from global ad testing from SEO were 3-4 years in the making. Right away, setting out the ship and then letting the business know that it's a long-term investment and that those things aren't going to pay off for 12 to 18 months potentially, because many companies will want to do SEO in quotation marks, I suppose, will want to do SEO. And then 6 months in, was like, oh, well, where's the results? Well, that's not working, and it's like, well, actually, if you dig a little deeper, you weren't listed anywhere for this key phrase 6 months ago, and now you're on page 2. Yeah, nobody clicks on page 2. Nobody cares at all. But that's actually a pretty massive achievement. Eventually, as long as it's going in the right direction, you'll get to page 1 if you keep that investment going. But if you don't, then you've just stopped short of the finish line. You've run the marathon, and you're 8 miles in and say, that's good enough. And you could have pushed through and got a little further. You would have started to see the results that you needed to sort of push you along.
Yeah, you definitely need a bit of patience. So part of a playbook is sort of creating something that's repeatable then as well. I mean, you touched on it slightly earlier about experimentation then. How do you sort of blend experimentation, with creating something that's repeatable? Because there's a lot of talk about certain channels, you're actually running out of bandwidth in certain channels after a while. The costs are perhaps going up, or they're just working, they're not working as well, if you like. How do you sort of blend that sort of repeatability with the experimentation then?
Create an experimentation backlog, right? So have regular experimentation brainstorming sessions with your team, with other people from the business, and just capture ideas and just start logging those in a backlog, and then make it a commitment to start executing those experiments on a regular basis. That in itself becomes its own playbook, and it becomes its own area of ideas that you can then tap from and say, yeah, this experiment idea came from our customer success team, and it's, we should go back to that well because they've got some really interesting ideas and it really had this kind of impact. And with the experimentation backlog, again, also create that so that it's in a very transparent way. So let people know, hey, if you've got ideas, here's a form, drop your ideas in for experiments that we can run as a demand generation or a growth function, and then decide sort of how you want to prioritize those based on a pretty simple, just sort of RICE method, and figure out, how many people can you actually touch and impact with that. And it's repeatable in the sense that if you create a process around it within the business to do that, then that's going to work. But, sort of pulling it back to the playbook idea is that might not work for the business, right? You may walk into a business where experimentation is not a thing that is favored or desired. And I can think of plenty of industries where you probably can experiment much, healthcare and legal and, areas that are highly regulated, where if you went in and you just started whacking in a bunch of experiments, quick, fast, and dirty, you might find yourself in a bit of trouble. And that might not be the best approach. So you've got to sort of take the temperature of the business and understand, whether or not you need to make those organizational changes first, and get everyone on board why you want to do that. Or if you just have to say, look, we're actually not going to have a culture of that sort of experimentation here. Or if we are, we're only going to do it in these very sort of niche, narrow bands that we can operate in.
Yeah, because it's time consuming as well, I guess, is the experimentation. It's good to be doing it, but ultimately you've only got so much bandwidth as a potentially small marketing team as well. You push from pillar to post as it is anyway, really. What if you're sort of working for an early stage startup then without much data? How would you approach that sort of situation then?
I feel like that's been my experience to date, to be honest with you. Yeah. The thing is, start collecting it as soon as possible. I would say from day one, make sure that everything's up and running from a statistical data capture analysis perspective. Declare to the business that you want to be data driven, and find out where the data is. That it's there, even if it's not necessarily being captured and surfaced. Everything's tracked now for the most part, and it's somewhere in the business. Now, if you can't access it, that's something that you can work on and you can start to build out. But essentially you can put things in place right away. When I joined V, immediately we started with, tracking conversions, tracking analytics, tracking SEO, tracking all the sort of major data points that we would need from a marketing function. And I was the only person in, and, the only remit really at the time was hiring people. So hiring people and building out a team. But I knew that if I brought them in and they didn't have any data to work from at all, they would be 3 months behind the 8 ball. So behind the 8 ball, sort of 3 months behind the curve. And so making sure that you've got that in place, the stuff that you can track and the stuff that you can record, then do it and start it as soon as possible, because you're going to start to build that library of data points, which you can then look back on. Now, 9 months in at V, I've got a treasure trove of things that I can say, okay, cool, this is where we're at, this is what we've achieved, and this is how we can take things into 22. And yeah, my confidence level on the accuracy of the data might be, a C+, but next year the goal is to get that to like a B. It's solid. We can forecast pretty well now because we've now got a whole year's worth of data and funnel metrics and funnel information to sort of pull from.
Great stuff. And what sort of tools do you generally use? I mean, Google Analytics, Google Optimize you talked about. What sort of tools do you tend to use in that sort of your situation, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of Microsoft has a free tool called Clarity, and Clarity enables you to sort of do some of the stuff that Hotjar does, especially if you're limited with budget. You know, Hotjar, you might not have the funds to do that. Definitely, you know, a good marketing automation suite. I know you mentioned HubSpot earlier. I've been a massive HubSpot advocate for years. And then, you know, other than that, you know, it's just about making sure you've got the tags implemented from all the major sort of social platforms and ad platforms to ensure that even if you're not advertising yet, you're pixeling people as they come through, so that you can start to build interested lists and for the future, you know, and maybe you won't use that. And that's, you know, a fairly basic sort of stack, but that's almost all you need really to actually start building out the playbook of what's going to work for the business and how you're going to start, you know, delivering on the results you've been tasked to do.
Yeah, it's the stuff that goes into it, which is the
Right.
time-consuming bit in a way. Well,
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed this chat, Nick. I mean, if people want to follow up with any questions for you, what's the best way of them getting in touch with you?
LinkedIn. Yeah, just connect with me on LinkedIn. I love chatting with people and you know, giving advice and, you know, and anything people want to know. I'm more than willing to have a chat.
It's been fantastic. I think people can get obsessed with the playbook, but actually how you put it in that, you know, you need a playbook, but you've got to build your own playbook makes a huge amount of sense. So thanks for sharing your knowledge with us.
Absolutely, Matt. Appreciate it.
Cheers, Nick.